Hi, I'm Rick Anthony, and welcome to the Someone You Should Know podcast, the podcast that focuses on musicians, authors, and interesting people. We like to say we're making a difference one artist at a time. So sit back, have a cold one, and get ready to meet someone you should know. The Someone You Should Know podcast prides itself in bringing you musicians, authors, and interesting people. Today, truly an interesting person. He's a regular host on the World According to Ben Stein show. He's a regular on the podcast circuit and the host of his own podcast. And as far as I can recall, the very first Contrarian I've ever had on the show. Will you please welcome all the way from Mexico, Myles Wakeham. Myles, welcome aboard.
Hey, thank you, Rick. Great to be with you.
Whereabouts in Mexico are you?
I am in the town of San Miguel de Allende, which is in the center of Mexico. We're about 3 hours bus trip north of Mexico City.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Let's take a moment and talk about the term contrarian. For anyone who's listening in today going, what the heck is he talking about? Would you please enlighten us exactly what a contrarian is?
Yeah, I didn't really even know what that was, to be honest with you. I came to the United States when I was 25 years old, back in 1989. It's dating me. But,
me too, buddy.
Yeah. But when I got to the States and I eventually realized, when in Rome, I had to become an American, which was 30 odd years ago when I did that, I started finding all of these natural contrary positions that this kid from down under had found himself in. And I think what ended up happening was it forced me to understand that although I felt like I was like everybody else, when I started looking at my background and looking at how I viewed the world and what I did with my life, I was very atypical to everybody else. Mm-hmm. I didn't know what a 401k was.
Right, yeah.
I didn't understand living in a country where I had to pay to go to see a doctor. I didn't understand any of that. I was a fish out of water. 30 years later, you would think by now I would have embraced it. But the truth was that every single time that I tried to take a normal, what I would call the social mantra, the normal social contract that all of my American friends had been raised on and had grown up with and never questioned, they were all new to me. So whenever I took on board the idea of, having a job, going to work, sitting in traffic, all of the
paying taxes,
take for granted, paying taxes,
yes.
Right? But the things we just take for granted, they didn't have the outcomes that I was expecting. I didn't make any money. I saw all these people who were like working really, really hard, and I could see this incredibly powerful work ethic. It was amazing to me. But every month that they'd finished their work, they didn't have anything to show for it. I'm like, well, I was looking at this like an immigrant, right? I'd look at everything and I'd say, you're making like $100,000. If you know what that looks like to some dude living in Nairobi?
Oh, right, exactly. Oh, gosh, yes. Anyone,
Mexico?
In impoverished countries, yeah, absolutely.
My God, if they had that sort of income, they'd be living like royalty. Mm-hmm. But you're barely scraping by every month. Why is that? And I questioned every single thing that was the norm, the social norms, where their money went. Well, and I realized how different I was. And all of a sudden, I started doing different things to them, things that were more suitable when you raise in a country, for example, where the universe talks to you. Like Australia doesn't have many people in it, mm-hmm. 25 million people, but it's a landmass the size of the United States. Everybody, in one way or another, is enjoying the bounty of the land, whether you're a miner or you work for a company that services the mining industry. You're a farmer or you work in an export country that exports wheat or grain. This is normal to us in Australia. And so you understand things like the weather and the harvest season and the cycles of nature. And you also understand that if you go outside of the house, there's a pretty good chance that anything crawling around on the ground will kill you.
That's true. Australia's such a beautiful country, but you've got some really interesting bugs and snakes and such. Jeez.
It's deadly. I mean, I've been in ICU from like a jellyfish sting.
Oh my!
So I mean, I know how that feels, but this is normal for us.
Right, you're used to it. Yeah.
We accept risk as part of our normal DNA, and I, with all of those things, I realized after a while how atypical I was to everybody growing up in the concrete urban jungles. And that's why I'm a contrarian.
Right. And here's the cool thing about him. Check this out, folks. He came to the United States in 1989, and he has since become a multimillionaire. He lives 100% free and unconstrained life. He has no job. And he never graduated high school, let alone going to college. You consider yourself a focused technologist. Can you explain that, what that's all about, too?
Yeah. I was raised actually as a musician. My mother stuck a violin under my chin when I was 5 and said, "Kid, you're going to be in the symphony orchestra one day." And as it happened, by the age of 11, I was in the South Australian Junior Symphony Orchestra.
Wow.
So, we put music ahead of math and English in my family.
I think a lot of my guests have done the same too.
Right.
Go ahead.
Right. But, musicians are interesting characters, and, we are atypical. We think differently to most people. We're more in tune with what's going on around us. We're sensitive.
Right. Very creative.
And those qualities don't necessarily connect with academia, and they don't connect with traditional, if you say to a musician, I'm going to give you a job, in corporate America for 40 hours a week, they'll look at you and go away. The only reason they want that is because they can't pay their rent.
Right. Yeah.
Right? It's not because that's their goal in life. It's because they're forced into that situation.
They're waiting on the record company to return their calls, basically, right?
Exactly. So, I get that. And I came from the same cloth. So what that meant was that I ended up, when I was a teenager, I had this naturally inquisitive mind. I was very sensitive to things that were going on about me. It just so happened that I got into electronics when I was like 13. I was a very technical kind of character, and then bought one of the very first ever personal computers that ever were released. That was in 1978. So
was it an Apple IIe, or what was it? Was it an Apple?
It was a Tandy TRS-80.
Tandy TRS-80. Yep. Know it well. Yep. Know it well. Yes, sir.
All right.
Yes, sir. So, Radio Shack. Gotta love them.
Yeah. And I had a father who was paying a lot of money to put me through sort of a private school, thinking that I'd hobnob with all of the rich and famous, and that was gonna serve me well. And my attitude was, I ain't learning anything here, Dad. I'm learning more in my bedroom with this computer, working out what it does. So I became a pretty good programmer, and convinced him, when I was about 15, that I should not finish school, leave it, and go and start a software company, because there was this thing I thought was going to be really big. And I don't know, maybe it was just the constant work of him having to pay for my education that I wore him down enough. In the end, he said, "Okay, kid, off you go, but it's on you. You screw up, you fix it." I'm like, I'm cool with that. So I did.
Well, that's nice to have a parent that allows that, because most of us said, this is the way I did it. This is the way I know how to do it. This is the way you're going to do it. Because, parents, they want the best for their kids. And they think that's the best thing for their kids. But when you've really got a knack for something, when you have actually got a talent for music and you don't develop that was a gift that was given to you. You have several gifts in your quiver, don't you now? Let's talk.
I kind of look at it like it's a right brain, a left brain thing, right? Like on the left brain, I'm very pragmatic and engineering focused and technical, and on the right side of my brain, I hear music when I wake up in the morning, and I need to pursue that. And I think as I've gotten older in life, the right brain didn't get enough attention at an earlier age, and now it's screaming for attention. So I've decided to put the left aside. But back in those days, I focused a lot of. I moved from violin to Spanish guitar. I became a classical guitarist. Then I turned that into a rock guitarist. joined bands, moved to Hollywood, did all of that. I worked in recording studios up and down Hollywood. I was playing in bands up and down the Sunset Strip. So I had my time in that world.
Right.
But I couldn't feed my family.
Right. Yeah. It's the hard thing to do. Yeah.
And when you've got the option to either go programming, which made a lot of money, or music, which fulfilled your passion but didn't, when I had a daughter, I became Mr. Responsible.
Absolutely.
And I decided that, and I regret that to this day, to be honest with you, but I decided that pursuing a life as a producer, engineer, or musician in Hollywood wasn't going to be enough to feed my family. And so I put my own needs aside to focus on being responsible. And I think the problem was your point about contrarianism. My version of responsible was very different to most people that I ended up meeting, working with, or seeing at a Starbucks. Because I always remember this. I was in Southern California. You'd go to a Starbucks, you'd be standing in line, you'd start up some conversation with the guy next to you, and they were always the same archetype. Like they wore the same sort of clothes. They were these like well-dressed people with corporate jobs, and they played golf on the weekend, and they drove a BMW. It was like you could take that model, you could stamp it across the board, and that was what everybody wanted. And you'd have a conversation with them, like, who are you? Tell me about you. Tell me about your DNA, your passion. What do you do? And all they could tell you was what they just watched on the TV the night before, or the stock tip on CNBC, or that was it. And I was like, this is an empty motion. This is not a life. And you get one shot at this, dude. Make the most of it. Because you just,
And the thing is, if you can follow your passion and make money out of it, then you've really got something. And that's the case what you've got there. Now, I just, I followed my passion. I did more than 40 years in radio and realized there's not a whole hell of a lot of money in radio. But one thing I did is I just recently retired on January the 1st. And I was going through your notes, and there was something you said, why should people throw out the traditional concept of retirement entirely? I am all ears, buddy, so help me out here.
That comes from an experience I had when I was 22. So my father, with his wisdom of letting me run loose as a young kid and leave school, he passed away when I was 22 years old, and I had to bury him. And in the process of doing that, it's kind of a very formative event that happens in all of our lives if you lose a parent or a family member or a loved one of some form. And I honestly wouldn't want anybody to have to go through that. But at the same time, I looked at it from an experiential point of view, and I looked at his life. And this was a man in the 20th century who avoided going to World War II because he had a sawmill accident and he lost his trigger finger. So for some reason he got out of the draft, and then he raised our family and my mother and me, and did all the right things. He did what I did. He gave up for himself, but he was loyal to the company, and for 40 years he worked for the same company, and he retired at 65, and he was dead at 67. I always look back at that and go, there but for the grace of God. I'm not going to go down that path. But then when we look deeper into it, as I started to unravel this man's story, because you see him as dad, you don't see him as a man with a history. But then when he's passed away, you now have to face the reality of putting together the estate and looking after my mom and everything. And I began looking at this man's history. And what I found was that he worked for a building materials company that made roofing materials for most of his career, well, all of his career. And he was actually killed by the company he worked for. The company made roofing materials that were made of blue asbestos.
There you go.
And so he ended up contracting lung cancer and then died shortly after he retired. And that was even worse to understand, because I realized all of a sudden I can't trust the that social contract,
Right, yes.
Go to school, study hard, get a good job, work hard, and one day you can retire. And it didn't work out for him, so it was not going to work out for me either. And I threw out the word retirement because I associate it with seeing my dead father lying on an aluminum table in a hospital, right? So I don't want retirement. I realized the most important thing I've got in this world is time. There's a finite resource of that. I can make an unlimited amount of money, but I don't ever have more time. And if I don't have quantity of time, I sure as hell am going to have quality.
Right.
And so what that meant was, if I can work hard early and make money and invest it, and I understand the nature of the universe and how the cycles work, I can create a situation where I get my time back. And so I haven't had a job for 25 years. So I don't know if you call that retirement, but I don't even use the word retirement. I just do what Myles does. I just follow my passion, and I change it according to the seasons, so I can live anywhere around the world and invest around the world, and I'm not afraid to do that. So why not live that life?
This is really cool, too. Not only is he living anywhere he wants to, he's in central Mexico. He and his wife in 2021 bought a large compound that had a bullfighting ring on it. And you're in the process of switching that whole thing over to a luxury home at a world-class recording studio. How is retiring in Mexico, or the idea of retiring in Mexico? Any traps and tips that you can impart to us if we decide to head south of the border?
No, I mean, here's the interesting thing about it. I came from another country to the United States, so I understand what life looks like on the other side of the wall. The truth is that it's not that difficult. But what often happens with a lot of countries that are out there that people might look at and say, maybe I want to spend the last quarter of my life living in Europe or living in Thailand or wherever it might be. A lot of countries make it very difficult for you to do that because getting a second residency or a second passport often requires huge monetary investments and buying real estate or investing in businesses and all these things that are often barriers to entry that are prohibitive. Not so much with Mexico. For $40 for an application form and a proof that you are not derelict and you've got some money, they'll give you a residency permit. It's a tricky with bureaucracy, but not impossible. And you can hire an attorney to, Teflon coat you through it. But it's not out of the question, and it's very easy. When my wife and I were looking at Mexico, we chose this area to spend most of our time in, although we still do spend some time in Australia. But we chose Mexico because it's time zone compatible with the US. And I'm only a 2-hour flight away from, my daughter, if I need to be, or if she wants to come down to us, or she might want to spend a lot of her life living in Mexico and then commuting back to the States to do work. I mean, the options are available. The economy down here is going gangbusters right now. I mean, it's nuts. And so it's a very nice place to be.
Is there a good housing boom down there right now?
There is. And what's in it, I had lunch with a friend of mine on the weekend that is a real estate agent. And he was telling me that in the past, a lot of the really expensive homes here, the $1 million+, $2 million+ homes, was sitting on the market for some time and weren't moving. All of a sudden, they're all moving now. He thought they were overpriced, but what's ended up happening was that they stayed where they were and the market came up to meet them.
Wonderful. Okay.
So now it's quite active in real estate. Wonderful. But you do have to pay cash. That's the only difference.
All right, very good.
You don't have debt down here. There's no mortgages.
Okay.
So you got to come in with a bunch of cash, but you're welcome when you come and you will love it. The weather here is beautiful and the people are great. It's fantastic.
Real good. Now, a lot of my podcast guests are musicians, and they're trying to make a name for themselves, kind of like you were talking about earlier with when you moved to Hollywood and such. A lot of them with minimum wage jobs. Can someone become financially free in the 21st century by still having a minimum wage job? Is it possible?
Look, there are two levers in the world here. You've got the lever of income and the lever of expenses. right? And
Right,
I
yeah,
think of this like a business owner would think of it. You can ratchet either up or down according to how you want to live. As we would in my younger years when I was a struggling artist, the best way that you could survive so that you could go on auditions or get gigs or do it, whatever, was you had to play the lever of expenses. You had to be able to live very frugally. And then you didn't rely on making as much money. So this is part of the problem I find that contrarianism has taught me that has made the difference for me. When people say success equals a six-figure salary or something like that, I'm like, no, success equals enough money for you to feel that you're not unsafe and you can survive. But that comes down to what you believe to be your expense ratio. So when we retire, the first thing most people do is they cut back on all of those unnecessary expenses because you don't have that money flowing in all the time.
Right,
now
yes.
you've gone from salary to IRA, 401k, Social Security, right? So you become fixed in your income. So you don't have the lever of adjusting it up or down anymore. So your only option is to adjust the lever of expenses. So most retirees will start pulling back on the expenses. Yeah. Right. So if you did that at the age of 20, but then you had both levers to manipulate, then all of a sudden you didn't need to make as much money to cut it if you're willing to live frugal. The problem is most people don't understand what that really looks like. Retirees surprisingly do.
Yes, we do, because we're wise.
We're wise, and we're
a lot of experience,
effective, right, at getting the most out of the minimal amount of price. I mean, you'll go and you'll do the 4 p.m. special at Denny's to get the cheaper price because, well, that's how it is, right? You're not doing it because that's a choice. You're doing it for frugality. Well, for a 23-year-old doing that, they could get the same meal. And I'll tell you this, any starving artist on the street of Hollywood, when I was there, if you said to them, hey, listen, I can get you a sandwich for like 40 cents on the dollar, they'd be like, sign me up. And they'd go straight there because it meant that they could have a little extra money to help pay the rent. And then they could go and they could do this audition or play this club or do this, whatever, right? It's no different. I think that we've lost that art. We've been swindled to some degree into this idea that we have to drive the BMW, we have to have the nice clothes, we've got to have the latest iPhone, we've got to have.
It's all about status, It's all about status.
All about status.
Yeah.
And who are we impressing?
Yeah, I know. That's just it. This is something that I learned later in life is the fact that run your own race. Don't try to keep up with the Joneses. Run your own race. Run Myles' race. Run Rick's race. Exactly. Who were you trying to compete with? You compete with yourself. Just try to be a better person each day, and that's just it. And
Rick, you sound like a musician because that's how musicians think.
Well, that's just it. Yeah, it's just many years of being with musicians.
Create my music. I'm going to create my identity.
Yeah.
I don't want to be influenced by everything. I mean, we are to some degree, but I don't want to be influenced by everything because I know that those that are willing to have the courage to go out there and do it on their terms are the ones that create the best art.
Oh, yeah.
And that, if you just have that capability inside of you, you can actually live on very, very little income and live a very, very happy life.
I agree with you. Totally agree with you. You've got, you're a host of a podcast show, fellow podcaster, Unconstrained Podcast. You teach the art of financial sustainability to your audience. Can you give me your 30-second elevator speech on the show? On what it's about?
It's basically a summation of what I've learned, but it's financial sustainability is the ability to generate 150% of your burn rate, that's your expenses, by not actually having to work or spend actual time in labor. And I explore how that looks, how that works, all the things that get in the way, and how you achieve it. And I have a book coming out that sort of...
That's right. I wanted. When is the book coming out?
Well, I'm so working on it now.
Okay, very good.
I'm hoping it'll be out this year for sure.
Okay.
I have an editor now who's forcing me to the keyboard, but I would expect that we'll probably have something out in the next 3
I want you back
months.
on when the book comes out.
All right,
we'll have you on for that particular thing. But the show notes will include the link to his podcast. I'm signing up, and I want you to do the same today, okay? Let's talk about some of your other links, Myles, real quick.
Well, for the most part, I think people can find me on beunconstrained.com.
Okay.
That's the main website. I have a Twitter thing that I rarely use, but for the most part, everything centers around that website.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, so that's
check out
it.
check out the podcast for sure, and you'll learn everything. Closing thoughts. Let's go ahead and talk about the fact that you being a musician, since this show is primarily musicians and authors and such, there's a feature that I love to include. It's called Tales from the Road. You being a musician for many years in Los Angeles, this is the most infamous road stories. We've all had gigs where everything went perfectly right. Mm-hmm. But every once in a while, we have one of those gigs. You say, "How in the world did I survive that? I got to the wrong venue. My vehicle broke down. I forgot the instruments. I plugged in, and all of a sudden, the power blew." Anything come to mind, Myles? Would be your tales from the road?
Yeah, but it's a little different slant on it than that.
Okay, go ahead.
It's a cautionary tale.
Okay.
I used to have a recording studio in the San Fernando Valley. I used to do a lot of demos for artists that were pitching to the labels, and I'd constantly be booked. And I felt that was the entire purpose of my life, was to do the best possible recording I could for them. And we produced hundreds of recordings in a short period of time for artists that many of them became successful and many did not. But as a result of that, I realized that there was this one particular situation where I was dealing with a band that were quite demanding. It was a country band, of all things.
Really?
And I ended up supporting them in what they wanted and put my own needs aside as an engineer for the whole process. And it just so happened that right at the time I was doing their recordings, my wife was in hospital and had a medical emergency. And I made the stupid mistake of not shutting down the session to go look after her, but to try to be loyal to my passion of music above all the pragmatic reality of everything. I think the cautionary tale that comes with this is that life gets in the way often of art.
Yes, it does.
And one has to be synergistic with the other. Mm-hmm. And I never will forget the fact that I made the stupid mistake of not going to the hospital when I should have. Thankfully, she came out okay, but it probably ended up costing me a marriage.
Oh, really?
And and I would say that for artists that are out there working their butts off and dealing with issues, whether they're on stage, on the road, in studios, in whatever form, don't ever put your family and your life behind your personal motivation of art.
I can totally agree with you, Myles. And in 2018, I had been married for going on 40 years at this point. And I had just gotten a new job. I was the operations manager of 5 radio stations in Missouri. And I was doing mornings and such and putting in 60 hours a week. And about the same time, my wife wound up having a blood clot go to her heart, and it got worse from there. She wound up passing away from the surgery that was associated with this. There's always a demand for you to be at work, but the thing is, you have to focus family first. And I learned that totally changed my perspective on my radio career, because I realized she was more important than what I was doing. I mean, there'll always be a job, as far as that goes. If they were to say, well, you're fired because you need to tend to your wife, well, then I would have walked out. Exactly. Yeah. But here's the thing. This actually ties into what we were talking about earlier. The lovely lady that I'm with right now is one of the most frugal-minded individuals there is. We go to Aldi's to go do our shopping. We wind up going to garage sales. We go to the second-hand shops and finding things. And I thank her very much, because I am so financially stable now that it's something that I didn't have 5-10 years ago. And I think she and you are probably like-minded, because she's incredibly creative, and she's very, very smart and very, very frugal. And I'm waiting for her to hear this podcast because I think she would really tune in. I think she'll definitely be subscribing to your podcast as well. Once again, we're speaking with Myles Wakeham today. This has been a real treat to have you on the show, man. I really appreciate that. Once again, all the information down in the show notes. I want everyone to check out his podcast. And, man, I really thank you so much for being on my show, man. I wish you really well with what you're doing in Mexico. I wish you well with your studio. And I hope you continue to enrich other people's lives with your podcast.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me on.
Hi, this is Rick Anthony, thanking you again for listening to this episode of Someone You Should Know. Now, if you're an aspiring musician or an established musician that's looking for a little exposure, I invite you to drop us a line at someoneyoushouldknowpodcast@gmail.com. That's someoneyoushouldknowpodcast@gmail.com. Also, I invite you to tell a friend about the Someone You Should Know podcast. I thank you for tuning in this time, and I invite you to check us out next time on the Someone You Should Know podcast, because you never know who's going to show up. Until next time, remember, God loves you, and so do I.